Imagine a cold December morning in 1971. Police officers enter a grand Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, a 19-room palace that speaks of wealth and success. But something is wrong. The lights have been burning for weeks. The house is silent except for one sound: organ music playing through the intercom system, hymns echoing through empty hallways. What they find inside will become one of America's most infamous cold cases. 5 bodies, a chilling confession letter, and a man who simply vanished into thin air. This is the story of John List, a Sunday school teacher, a devoted father, a respected accountant, and the November day in 1971 when he methodically murdered his entire family, then disappeared for 18 years. To understand what happened at 431 Hillside Avenue, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when John Emil List seemed to embody the American dream. Born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, John List was raised in a strict German-American Lutheran household. His parents, particularly his mother Alma, instilled in him an unwavering faith and rigid moral code. John was an only child, disciplined and obedient, the kind of boy who colored inside the lines and never questioned authority. During World War II, List served his country. Later, he fought in Korea. He came home decorated, educated, and ready to climb the ladder of success. He earned his degree in business administration and became an accountant, a profession that suited his meticulous, ordered mind perfectly. In 1951, John met Helen Morris Taylor, a widow with a daughter named Brenda. Helen was different from John, more worldly, more experienced. She'd been married before and had lived a life beyond the church walls that defined John's existence. But John fell in love, and in December 1951 they married. Helen brought secrets into the marriage, though. Secrets that would fester like poison over the years. She had contracted syphilis from her first husband, a disease she never disclosed to John. As the decades passed, this untreated illness would progress to its tertiary stage, affecting her mind and behavior, turning her into someone John could barely recognize. But in those early years, things seemed promising. John and Helen had 3 children together: Patricia, born in 1955, John Frederick, born in 1956, and Frederick, born in 1958. John provided for his family, moving up the corporate ladder. He taught Sunday school at their Lutheran church. He led a Boy Scout troop. To the outside world, the Lists were the embodiment of 1950s suburban virtue. By 1965, John had achieved something remarkable. He'd been appointed vice president and comptroller of a bank in Jersey City. With this success came the ultimate symbol of achievement, a mansion called Breeze Knoll. The house at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield was a marvel, a 19-room Victorian mansion with marble fireplaces, an elegant ballroom, and a stunning stained glass skylight over that ballroom, rumored to be a signed Tiffany original worth over $100,000. For a man like John List, who craved respect and status, Breeze Knoll was everything. But mansions are expensive, very expensive, and beneath the veneer of success, cracks were already forming. John's mother, Alma, now 84 years old, lived with them on the 3rd floor. Helen's drinking had worsened over the years. The untreated syphilis was ravaging her mind. She was barely able to leave her bed by the end. The children were growing up, becoming teenagers in the turbulent late 1960s and early 1970s. The world was changing in ways that terrified John List. This was the era of Vietnam War protests, of the sexual revolution, of youth rebellion. Everything John believed in, authority, tradition, unwavering faith, seemed under assault. And his daughter Patricia, 16 years old and beautiful, wanted to be an actress. She was dating. She was becoming independent. To John's rigid religious mind, the theater was sinful, dating was dangerous, and his daughter's emerging sexuality was a threat to her immortal soul. His sons were becoming strangers to him. Helen had stopped going to church entirely. One day, in a moment that must have cut John to his core, his wife declared she wanted to leave the Lutheran church altogether. The family pastor would later report overhearing Helen say to John, "If you were half the man my first husband was, we wouldn't be having the troubles we're having." But the worst was yet to come. In 1971, the bank where John worked closed its doors. John List, vice president, comptroller, provider, was laid off. He was unemployed. The mortgage on Breeze Knoll was crushing. Bills were piling up. And John List could not bring himself to tell anyone the truth. Instead, he created an elaborate charade. Every morning, he put on his suit and tie. List was the kind of man who wore a suit and tie to mow the lawn, and he left the house as if going to work. He drove to the Westfield train station, where he sat in his car or on a bench, reading newspapers for 8 hours. Then he came home as if nothing was wrong. Week after week this continued. John was stealing money from his mother's bank accounts to keep up with the mortgage payments. He encouraged his children to get part-time jobs, claiming it would teach them responsibility, when really he desperately needed the money. The walls were closing in. And in John List's fevered religious mind, a terrible solution began to take shape. The morning of November 9, 1971, began like any other Tuesday in the List household. Patricia, John Frederick, and Frederick got ready for school. Helen made coffee in the kitchen. Alma remained in her third-floor apartment. No one knew that John List had been planning their deaths for weeks. List had tried to set a date before, All Saints' Day, 8 days earlier, but he couldn't go through with it then. Now he had made his decision. He had purchased 2 handguns, his 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic and his father's Colt .22 caliber revolver. Both were loaded and ready. The children left for school. The house grew quiet. John found Helen in the kitchen, drinking her morning coffee. He raised the gun and shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly, never knowing what happened. John dragged his wife's body through the house and laid her out on a sleeping bag in the ballroom. The grand ballroom with its Tiffany skylight, the room that represented everything he had wanted to achieve. Then he calmly cleaned the blood from the kitchen floor. Next, he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, to his mother's apartment. Alma was still in bed. John shot her above the left eye. Her body was too heavy to move, so he left her there in the hallway, knowing he'd have to explain her location later. Then John List sat down and made himself lunch. He cleaned his dishes. And he waited for his children to come home from school. Patricia was first, returning home around 3 p.m. As his 16-year-old daughter entered the house, John shot her in the back of the head. He carried her body to the ballroom and placed it next to her mother. 13-year-old Frederick arrived next. The same cold execution. Another body in the ballroom. But John List's final act that day was not yet complete. He drove to Westfield High School to watch his eldest son, John Frederick, play in a soccer game. Imagine it. A father who had just murdered 3 members of his family, sitting in the bleachers, cheering for his 15-year-old son. Was he compartmentalizing? Was he in shock? Or was he simply a monster wearing a father's mask? After the game, John drove his son home. They entered the house together. And then, in a struggle that left bullet holes scattered across the boy's chest and face, John List shot his eldest son 10 times. The gun had misfired at first, and John Jr. fought for his life, but in the end, he died like the others. John List arranged his son's body in the ballroom with the rest of his family. 5 bodies on sleeping bags in a row. Then he turned on the intercom system and set it to play hymns, religious music to accompany the dead. He left lights burning throughout the house to make it appear occupied. In his study, John sat down at his desk and wrote a 5-page confession letter to his pastor, Reverend Eugene Rewinkle. The letter was written on yellow legal paper in List's neat, methodical handwriting. It began, "I am very sorry to add this additional burden to your work." In the letter, List laid out his justifications for what he'd done. He was facing bankruptcy. He couldn't support his family. They would have to go on welfare, live in poverty, face public shame. His wife had stopped going to church. His daughter wanted to be an actress, which List saw as a sinful profession. The world was too evil, too corrupt. He had to save their souls. "I know that many will only look at the additional years that they could have lived," List wrote. "But if finally they were no longer Christians, what would be gained?" He actually believed he was sending them to heaven. By murdering his family, he thought he was guaranteeing their salvation. And in a twisted logic that revealed the depths of his narcissism, List concluded that suicide was a greater sin than murder. Killing himself would bar him from heaven, but if he killed his family and then confessed his sins to God, he might still be forgiven. He might still see them again in the afterlife. The letter ended with instructions for the funeral arrangements. He wanted the bodies cremated, the costs kept low. And then, almost as an afterthought, a chilling postscript. "P.S. Mother is in the hallway in the attic, 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move." Before leaving, John List did something that speaks to his calculated planning. He went through the entire mansion and cut his face out of every single family photograph. He destroyed his passport. He wanted to ensure that police would have no recent pictures of him to use in their search. The next morning, John List walked out of Breeze Knoll, left his car at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, and vanished. For nearly a month, no one knew. List had planned everything meticulously. He'd stopped mail delivery, newspaper delivery, and milk delivery to the house in the days before the murders. He'd called the children's schools to say the family was visiting a sick relative out of town. The lights burned in the mansion day and night. Neighbors noticed, but suburban etiquette dictated not prying too deeply into others' affairs. Days turned into weeks. One by one, the lights began to burn out, and still no one came. Finally, on December 7, 1971, nearly a month after the murders, Patricia's drama coach became concerned about her extended absence. The coach called the police. When officers entered 431 Hillside Avenue, they heard organ music playing through the house. Following the sound to the ballroom, they discovered a scene from a nightmare. 4 bodies laid out on sleeping bags side by side. Helen List, Patricia, John Frederick and Frederick, all shot in the head, all carefully arranged. The smell of death was overwhelming. On the 3rd floor, they found Alma's body, exactly where List had left her. And on the desk in John List's study, they found the confession letter. The response was immediate and massive. Westfield was a quiet, affluent community where violent crime was virtually unknown. This was, at the time, one of the most shocking murders in New Jersey history. The FBI joined the investigation. Police combed through every piece of evidence. List's green 1963 Chevrolet Impala was found at JFK Airport, but there was no evidence he had boarded a flight. Investigators discovered that List had withdrawn money from his mother's bank accounts before disappearing. They found that he'd been unemployed for months, maintaining his elaborate fiction of going to work each day. They learned about the family's financial troubles, Helen's alcoholism and illness, the tensions with his daughter. But they couldn't find John List. Every lead went nowhere. Some speculated he'd fled to Germany. He spoke German from his time there during the war. A worker at the German consulate even reported seeing someone matching List's description, inquiring about a visa. Others theorized he might be the infamous D.B. Cooper, who'd hijacked a plane and parachuted away with ransom money in November 1971, just days after the List murders. But nothing could be confirmed. The funeral for the List family was held on December 11, 1971. 5 hearses lined up outside the Redeemer Lutheran Church in Westfield. The mother of Helen List wept as she buried her daughter and 3 grandchildren. Friends of the children carried the small coffins. The community was in shock, trying to process how such evil could exist in their peaceful suburb. Meanwhile, 9 months after the murders, Breeze Knoll caught fire. The mansion was completely destroyed. It was officially ruled arson, but no suspects were ever identified. Some wondered if it was List himself, returning to destroy evidence. Others speculated it was someone who thought the house was cursed. The truth was never discovered. Lost in the fire was that stunning Tiffany skylight. Worth, it was later determined, about $100,000, more than enough to have saved the List family from financial ruin, if only John had known or cared. Years passed. The case grew cold. John List's family was buried and mourned, but the man himself seemed to have vanished into thin air. Detectives continued working the case, but with no photographs of List and no leads, they had nothing to work with. John List had become a ghost. But John List wasn't a ghost. He was very much alive and starting over. After fleeing New Jersey, List had traveled by train, first to Michigan, then to Colorado. In Denver, he took on a new identity, Robert Peter Clark. It was actually the name of one of his former college classmates, a name he'd remembered and stolen. As Robert Clark, List found work as a cook at a Holiday Inn. He grew a mustache. He ditched his formal suits for more casual clothes. But otherwise, he made little effort to disguise himself. He didn't dye his hair or dramatically alter his appearance. Remarkably, this minimal effort worked. In Denver, List met a woman named Dolores Miller. She was a devout Lutheran like him. They fell in love, or at least what passed for love in John List's emotionally stunted world. In November 1985, 14 years after murdering his first family, John List married Dolores. She had no idea who he really was. The couple eventually moved to Midlothian, Virginia, a suburb of Richmond. There, Robert Clark resumed the life he'd always wanted. He found work as an accountant. He and Dolores attended a Lutheran church regularly. He was respected in the community. It was as if he'd hit a reset button on his life, erasing everything that had come before. Dolores knew her husband as a quiet, religious man who didn't talk much about his past. He told her his first wife had died of cancer, and that he'd been estranged from his children. She had no reason to doubt him. Robert Clark seemed like a perfectly ordinary man. Maybe a bit rigid, maybe a bit secretive, but ordinary. For nearly 18 years this worked. John List, now Robert Clark, lived a peaceful life in Virginia. He had escaped justice. The case in New Jersey had gone cold. The world had moved on. But in the late 1980s, a new television show was about to change everything. In 1988, a show called America's Most Wanted premiered on Fox. Hosted by John Walsh, whose own son had been murdered, the show featured unsolved crimes and asked viewers to help law enforcement catch dangerous fugitives. It was revolutionary. True crime meets reality television with real stakes. By 1989, the show was a hit. Producers were looking for compelling cases to feature, and someone suggested the List family murders. It was one of the oldest cold cases they'd ever considered. 17 years had passed since the murders, but it was also one of the most shocking. Could they really find John List after all this time? The challenge was clear. They had no recent photographs of List. He'd destroyed them all. They had some old pictures from the 1960s, but nearly 2 decades had passed. List would be 63 years old now. What would he look like? The producers approached a forensic artist named Frank Bender, a Philadelphia sculptor who had gained fame for his ability to reconstruct faces from skulls and to age progress photographs. Bender was as much artist as scientist. He worked on intuition as much as anatomy, and he had an uncanny ability to capture not just how someone might look, but who they might become. Bender studied the old photographs of John List. He consulted with a forensic psychiatrist named Richard Walter. Together, they tried to imagine who John List would be at 63. Would he have changed his appearance? How would age have affected him? What would his life look like? Bender concluded that List wouldn't have changed much. This was a man who wore a suit and tie to mow his lawn. He was rigid, conservative, desperate to appear respectable and in control. So Bender sculpted a bust of an older John List wearing a suit and tie. He added thick-framed glasses, reasoning that List would want to appear intelligent and authoritative. He gave him a slightly receding hairline and jowls. He painted the bust to look as lifelike as possible. The bust was remarkably detailed. It didn't just show what List might look like. It captured his essence, his personality. On May 21, 1989, America's Most Wanted aired the List family murders case. John Walsh stood next to Frank Bender's bust, describing the crimes, showing the old photographs, asking viewers, "Do you know this man?" The response was immediate. More than 200 tips flooded in from across the country. Most were dead ends, people who resembled List or had similar stories but weren't him. The task of sifting through these tips seemed overwhelming. But one tip stood out. It came from a woman in Denver, Colorado, named Wanda Flannery. She'd been watching the show with her daughter when Frank Bender's bust appeared on screen. Both women had the same reaction. "That looks like Bob Clark." Wanda Flannery had been neighbors with Bob Clark years earlier in Denver. She remembered him as a quiet, religious man. Lutheran. An accountant. She hadn't thought about him in years, but when she saw that bust, the resemblance was uncanny. She called the show. Investigators quickly discovered that Bob Clark had moved to Richmond, Virginia. They found his address, his workplace. On June 1, 1989, just 11 days after the America's Most Wanted episode aired, FBI agents walked into an accounting office in Richmond and arrested a man named Robert Peter Clark. Clark insisted he was not John List. He maintained his alias even as he was extradited back to New Jersey. But the evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints matched military records from John List's service. His physical appearance matched not just Frank Bender's bust, but old photographs. And perhaps most tellingly, he bore an old scar on his body, a surgical scar that matched John List's medical records. On February 16, 1990, after months of denying his identity, Robert Peter Clark finally confessed. He was John Emil List. The trial of John List began in Union County, New Jersey. It was a media sensation. 18 years had passed since the murders, but the horror of what List had done had not diminished. If anything, time had made it worse. For nearly 2 decades, this man had lived freely while his family lay dead and buried. List's defense attorney argued that his client suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service. He claimed List had a fragmented, obsessive-compulsive personality and was ill-equipped to function under overwhelming difficulties. List believed he was acting for the salvation of his family in a godless world that no longer made sense to him. The prosecutor painted a different picture. John List was cruel, calculating, and evil. He wanted a new life, so he simply closed the accounts on the old one. He murdered 5 innocent people, 3 of them children, because they had become inconvenient. His religious justifications were nothing more than narcissistic delusions. The trial included testimony from neighbors, police investigators, and psychological experts. The confession letter was entered into evidence, despite defense objections that it should be protected by priest-penitent privilege. The judge ruled against this argument. List himself testified. He maintained that he'd done what he had to do. He claimed his financial situation was desperate, that his family was falling away from faith, that he saw no other option. He said he'd been praying for forgiveness every day since the murders. In a television interview years later, List would tell journalist Connie Chung, I feel when we get to heaven we won't worry about these earthly things. They'll either have forgiven me or won't realize what happened. I'm sure that if we recognize each other that we'll like each other's company just as we did here, when times were better. The level of delusion was staggering. List genuinely believed he would be reunited with his family in heaven. He believed they would forgive him for executing them in cold blood. The jury was not convinced by his remorse or his religious justifications. On April 12, 1990, John Emil List was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, List made a final statement. "I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened. I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding and prayer." The judge responded with words that have echoed through the decades. John Emil List is without remorse and without honor. After 18 years, 5 months and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John F. List to rise from the grave. List was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, 1 for each member of his family. The sentences meant he would be ineligible for parole for nearly 125 years. At 64 years old, John List would die in prison. And he did. On March 21, 2008, John List died at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. He was 82 years old. He was buried next to his mother, Alma. His second wife, Dolores, who had been blindsided by the revelation of who her husband really was, stood by him initially but eventually divorced him. She'd married a man named Bob Clark and discovered she'd actually married a family annihilator. The betrayal was complete. The List family murders remain one of the most disturbing and perplexing cases in American criminal history. The questions it raises are profound and troubling. How could a father systematically murder his own children? How could a man who taught Sunday school, who led Boy Scout troops, who professed deep religious faith, commit such evil? Was John List insane? Or was he simply a narcissist who couldn't face failure? The forensic psychiatrists who examined List couldn't agree. Some believed he suffered from legitimate mental illness, obsessive-compulsive disorder, PTSD, a delusional disorder. Others believed he was simply a coward and a killer who dressed his selfishness in religious language. What we know for certain is that John List valued appearance over reality. He cared more about how he looked to the world than about the actual lives of his family. When his carefully constructed image threatened to crumble, when the mask of suburban success began to slip, he chose murder over honesty. He couldn't tell his family he'd lost his job. He couldn't admit failure. He couldn't face the possibility of public shame. So instead he killed 5 people and ran away. The case also raises questions about how killers hide in plain sight. For 18 years, John List lived as Robert Clark in Middle America. He remarried. He went to church. He worked as an accountant. His neighbors thought he was quiet but normal. How many other fugitives are living similar double lives, hiding behind new identities and ordinary facades? The List case also demonstrated the power of forensic art and public engagement in solving cold cases. Frank Bender's bust, created with a combination of science, intuition, and psychology, led directly to List's capture. It showed that even after decades, even with minimal evidence, justice could still be served if the public was engaged and technology was leveraged correctly. Today, a new house stands where Breeze Knoll once loomed over Hillside Avenue. The List family murders have been the subject of books, television documentaries, podcasts, and even inspired fictional works. Netflix's series The Watcher featured a character named John Graff, clearly based on John List, who murders his family in almost identical circumstances. The crime fascinates us because it shatters our assumptions about safety and normalcy. John List looked like everyone's father, everyone's neighbor, everyone's Sunday school teacher. He was educated, employed, religious. He was supposed to protect his family, not destroy them. But on November 9, 1971, John Emil List proved that evil doesn't always wear an obvious mask. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie. Sometimes it teaches Sunday school. Sometimes it sits in the bleachers at a soccer game, cheering for a son it plans to murder hours later. Helen List, Alma List, Patricia List, Frederick List, and John Frederick List never got to see justice in this life. They were murdered by someone who was supposed to love them, someone who claimed he was saving their souls even as he took their lives. But in the end, John List did not escape. His carefully crafted new identity crumbled. His narcissistic delusions were exposed. And he spent his final years exactly where he belonged, behind bars, forced to confront what he'd done, no longer able to run. The voices of his victims did rise from the grave, just as the judge promised. And they will continue to rise, for as long as we tell this story and remember their names. This is the story of the List family murders, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, the poison of religious fanaticism, and the terrible cost of valuing appearance over human life. If you're interested in learning more about this case, I recommend the true crime book Death Sentence by Joe Sharkey, the NJ.com podcast, Father Wants Us Dead, and various episodes of Forensic Files and American Justice that covered the case in detail. And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with financial hardship, unemployment, or family problems, help is available. You are not alone, and violence is never the answer.